In this video, I'm going to show you why homeowners and DIYers botch staining floors almost every single time. Floor refinishing is very simple, but it is not very easy. So let's take a look at this board here. I have 5 different sections here, and at first glance, they all look the same. I have prepped each section of wood slightly differently. Let's throw some red mahogany stain on there, which is a notoriously difficult color to work with, and we're going to see what it looks like. This first section has been sanded with 36 grit. This next section has been sanded with 60 grit. This section has been sanded with 80 grit. This section has been sanded with 120 grit. And this section has been water popped. Now let's peel the tape up to give a little bit more perspective. Now to the untrained eye, this may not be that different, but if we were to start here, our 36 grit is probably a good 10 to 20% darker than our 60 grit. All right, our 60 grit is probably about 10% darker than our 80 grit. And our 80 grit is about 10% darker than our 120 grit. And finally, our water popped area is much darker than the 120 grit. What happens when DIYers go to stain a floor is they look at it and it looks like this section down here. It's like, oh, I got all the finish off. It looks smooth. It looks good. It feels good on my hands. But what they don't know is that in some areas, they've got 36 grit marks. In some areas, they've got 80 grit marks. In some areas, they polish it off real nice with 120. In other areas, they spilled water on the floor and sweated, and it's going to be real dark. And when this happens, you wind up with an incredibly uneven stain job. Usually, it's the worst around the edges because using the floor edger, they went around with 36 grit and then maybe 80 grit. And they didn't get all those marks out when they came with the orbital sander, and they didn't get all those marks out with the buffer at the end, so the job just becomes blotchy. The other part of this that I can't demonstrate on this board is that every single floor sanding machine has a different scratch pattern. Every single one of these scratch patterns becomes incredibly visible when hit with the stain. The edger scratch pattern looks like this. It's this circular disc, but only the front part touches. So it's just a tiny little sliver of the circle. Belt sander scratches are going to look like long, straight lines, oftentimes all next to each other. Palm sander and orbital scratches are going to be random little squigglies all through the floor. Every single one of these patterns absorbs the stain differently. And to get a perfectly even stain job, if there is such a thing, you must have one pattern in one grit that has sanded everything perfectly flat. So in most cases, that's going to be an 80, 100, or 120 grit. But you have to have gotten all of the lower grit marks out from like the 36, and you have to get all of the marks out from the edger and from the belt sander. If you do not, they will all show up as dark places in your floor. I see this happen all the time. But just like how you can't see different grits just by looking at the floor, you cannot see all these marks unless you get a very bright light out and inspect the floor. The last little trick I'll leave you with, if you want to DIY your own stain job, water pop the whole thing. A good water pop's where I just take regular sink water and I soak the grain of the wood will open up all the pores in the floor. All I'm going to do is wipe my cloth over the wood. Pro floor guys oftentimes use backpack sprayers and then rag it down to get any excess off. This will cover for a multitude of mistakes in this process. If you do decide to DIY your hardwood floors and you want to stain them, water pop and get a very bright inspection light to inspect everything during the process to make sure you're getting all of the different machines' marks out. If you do this, you have a decent shot at getting a good stain job. If this sounds like too much, you might want to think about just sticking with a natural clear finish. If you stick with natural, you do not have to worry about it turning different colors in the different grits in the different areas when you put the finish down. You only have to worry about it being smooth. Now that they've dried a bit, you can see the difference a little bit more. It may be a little difficult to see on camera, but this 36 grit sanded area is way darker than the 120 grit sanded area. And with every grit that I go up, the floor gets just a little bit lighter. Obviously with the Waterpop, it got darker again. If you're looking for some good, easy to use products to refinish your floors with, I'll drop some links down in the description. Guys, if you're feeling overwhelmed about this process, or maybe yours hasn't gone well, I do offer consulting services. I'll drop a link to them down in the bio. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you might like this one popping up on your screen right now.